Hi, guys. Welcome to the Gentleman's Jury. I'm your host, Robbie, and with me today is my guest, Andrew.
Hi guys.
And today we're going to talk about a couple things, primarily some of the things we've been seeing since Biden's taken office, but also some stuff I covered in my last video, like some of the historical concepts that might help you better understand why we're facing the political climate we are today. So, the first question I wanted to talk to you about was how do you feel, especially because we know that Biden's pushing for more of the Green Deal, focus more on imported oil instead of exported oil from foreign governments. How do you think that's going to affect more people who, like for instance, the 50,000 people that just lost their jobs over the Keystone Pipeline?
Well, it's really interesting because they kept saying that, we aren't actually losing jobs and we're going to be gaining green sector jobs and all that stuff, but we really haven't seen any evidence of that. Um, and a comment that I saw that was really interesting as well was, well, if we're going into green energy, why would you cut, what we're doing right now or what we already have planned and going instead of just working on expanding into the green energy separately, right? Because you're not giving us any extra jobs, you're just taking the ones away. So I think it's only going to get worse as far as that goes. I mean, they made a lot of people angry with that. Um, and once gas prices go up and it starts affecting the average American, then the Democrats are going to run into the same problem they always have whenever they are in control, and they start pushing their policy. Is that, well, turns out average people don't really much care for their policies. I have a feeling we'll see the results of that here in a couple years.
Right, and speaking of the raised prices on oil, one of the interesting things that you and I had a conversation right before leading up to starting this recording was that big oil was in support of shutting down the Keystone Pipeline.
Oh yeah, they donated way more to Biden's camp than they did to Trump. Which is kind of funny how that works because they donate to everybody. They just donate a little more to one person. Um, and so either way, they're kind of covered, I think is the way they look at it. But we definitely know that they were in support of shutting down the Keystone Pipeline. And even before Biden had taken office, they had started ramping up their development of offshore oil drilling sites. So it's just kind of interesting to see how, even before all this goes down, they sort of knew what was coming and started getting ready to take advantage of it. And so that's your big companies like ExxonMobil.
Right, and so another and kind of leading further into that, you talked about the price hike in oil and how that'll start affecting the average American. When you compare what we're seeing right now to, say, some of the policies Trump had, where we were exporting more oil than we were importing, and our economy was starting to kind of recover. With everything that we're about to probably about to feel, do you feel like we're going more into like the Obama administration's era of we'll just cut more corners?
What do you mean by we'll just cut more corners?
Like we'll just
Because I want
cut
to make
the
sure we're talking about the same thing.
like we see the problem, but instead of addressing the source, we're just gonna cover some symptoms and say we're doing well.
Well, and I mean, they don't even really have to anymore because the media is just so in it for the Biden Harris administration. If you've been watching any of the White House press briefings, I mean, they're a joke now. They've been asking, questions like, well, is he going to repaint Air Force One? But
Really?
nobody is asking the really hard questions, except for a few brave souls. and they basically just get yelled down.
Huh. I actually haven't watched any of the recent press conferences in the White House. That actually kind of that disturbs me a little bit because like when you talk about some presidents that I agree with most people that Trump may not have been the greatest president in any sense of the word, but what he was doing right far outweighed the kind of hate he got. But when you watched a press conference with him, he was getting just hammered with some tough questions. So I think it's hilarious that Biden just kind of gets this pass. Like, oh, do you think the color of the what do you think you're going to change the color of the drapes to in the Oval Office? It just
I mean, these are important questions, not the fact that we're in a global pandemic, not the fact that we're re-entering crazy climate agreements, not the fact that we're, apparently trying to stop the deportation of illegal immigrants. None of that stuff's important. What's really important is what's Joe Biden's favorite ice cream flavor? And we actually got an answer on that one. You know what it is?
no, I don't.
It's chocolate chip.
Oh my god! Of course, Netch. Um. So then that leads me to ask the question: what kind of questions are they giving Kamala?
Is she being asked questions right now?
I mean, I would assume so, since everyone kind of already knows that Biden is probably not going to be our president for terribly much longer.
I mean, all I've been seeing is glowing pieces, like in the New York Times, talking about how she is, the first woman of color in the vice presidency, da 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 da, and talking about her historic rise and how she's, the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Interesting, especially considering when you look at her quote unquote historic rise, she mainly got into politics because of the affair she was having with San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown.
Well, I mean, she was the DA in San Francisco for how many years?
I'm not actually sure on that one. I didn't even know she was the DA of San Francisco.
I believe it was San Francisco.
I I just know that she really picked up like publicly for her political career when it was found out that she was part of the affair Willie Brown was having.
Oh, sorry, she was attorney. Yeah, she was district attorney of San Francisco, 2004 to 2011, and then
Oh,
attorney general of California from 2011 to 2017. And I
interesting.
think her DA timeline there overlaps with the time that she was having an affair, because I believe that was in 2006, right?
No, she was having an affair in the mid 90s.
Oh, okay. Well, then
So,
that's very interesting. And then she becomes district attorney of San Francisco
yeah, I kind of
in
seeing some
'04.
some dots connecting there. So I think it's interesting that she gets painted in such a bright picture, especially when you look at when she was a representative for, I think it was a county,
Hmm?
or not a county. She
She was
had
a
an
United States senator.
oh, that's right. Sorry. Um, when you look at the district that she belonged to, it is the biggest dump. Just pop up tents everywhere. I'm sure you could just walk down that street, a couple of those streets, and find hundreds of needles. So it's interesting that they think that she'll be able to govern a country well, considering she couldn't support her district.
Honestly, I'm amazed, or I'd be amazed if you could find drug needles in Kamala Harris's district, considering she spent most of her time locking up black men for minor drug offenses.
which is which is another hilarious thing because then she goes and jokes about smoking pot in college.
Yep. So, she's just a gem, and she's historic, and we can just keep saying that all day because that's the only thing that
Right.
matters.
Kind of getting back on track with Biden. One of the things that you had mentioned earlier, kind of prior to this video, was how the media paints Joe. Since Trump was considered Satan, Joe obviously has to be considered God as a counterbalance. Maybe not God, but as
Messianic figure. It's like a messiah,
right.
modern day
So
Jesus.
because we know what Kamala's, what the Democratic Party really is the Democratic Party's plan, but Kamala's part in the Democratic Party's plan, does that make her Judas?
It may or may not. Although Judas was more of a betrayer, right? So he, turned Christ over. But I don't think that's really her ploy here. I think she's going to be more of a Brutus.
An even better historical reference, especially considering in the last video I compared our current political turmoil to the fall of the Republic era Rome turmoil, and that sums up the reforming faction, or in Rome's case, the more liberal faction,
well,
perfectly.
well, and it's funny because when I was listening to that and you were making that comparison, I just kept thinking, well, that's how it's going to go, right? She's going to lead a bunch of senators in there. They're going to stab him in the back and then, fall of the Republic.
Metaphorically stab him in the back.
Ugh, I don't know, man.
Maybe literally. I
They
mean,
might want to ramp up their metal detectors.
I don't. I mean, he's old. Just give him a little bit of something in his soup, like like you said earlier.
Yeah, he's going to need an official taste tester. I would not want to do that job.
Speaking of kind of the Democratic Party's plan, how interesting is it to you that Georgia, of all states, turned from the conservative stronghold to we've lost the Senate because of them?
Well, interesting is a word for it. Um, the governor certainly didn't seem like he knew what was going on. Um, and it didn't sound like really anybody did. There was a lot of little ploys to change election laws right before the election happened. And that revolves around stuff like mail-in voting and how everything is counted. Which is not new as a concept. Um, this was the most that had ever been changed, though, and of course the pandemic was used as an excuse for that. Um, but I definitely think that there's an explanation out there for it other than, well, everybody just decided that they like Joe Biden.
Right, and it's not even in Joe Biden that we're talking about right now, because I have some things to say about the election process and how that all panned out. It was more that the fact that the Senate in what is staunchly a conservative state, other than Atlanta, which it, it's just they staunchly supported the Democratic Party in the Senate. So now the Democratic Party holds the House, the Senate, and the presidency.
Well, and it's funny because those Republican senators originally won those, and then they had to um, basically do a re-election because they didn't win by a high enough percentage. And the going explanation for that is that Trump wasn't on the ticket, right? And so the media kept making everything about Trump, and Trump kept making everything about himself. And so it just drove people that otherwise would have voted for him to not vote for him. Or, the bigger issue is that it just didn't drive out his supporter or his base. So that's the going political theory, the non-conspiracy theory.
The non-conspiracy. I like that. The non-conspiracy theory. Um. So kind of getting back into the election. How I mean, me and Zach had previously talked about this too. How a whole bunch of mathematicians, mostly statisticianists, had gotten together and ran the statistics for Joe Biden's win in Wisconsin. I think it was Michigan, Wisconsin, um, Philadelphia, and Georgia.
I saw
And
one for New Mexico and Arizona as well.
right, I I didn't actually read about those ones. This one was specifically for the four big ones, and how overnight, even if the counting hadn't stopped, it is statistically improbable. Like almost border. I mean, they consider it impossible, but you can't say it's impossible.
Well, yeah,
Um,
nothing's technically impossible.
right. That all those votes went directly to Biden.
Yeah, the one I saw for Arizona and New Mexico, I mean, he had all the data out on his Excel spreadsheet, and he noticed that the really weird thing is that the percentage of the votes that were going towards Biden in specific key counties, because originally it had all been going for Trump, and it was like all coordinated and the exact same percentage that Biden got the flip and the lead by. And so all these counties had Biden winning by the exact same percentage.
Interesting.
And so his conclusion is that it had to have been an algorithm of some kind that just added votes, um, when it saw that Biden needed them so that he would only win by a certain margin.
Right, as to make it not too suspicious of his victory. Um, Now we'll step away from the election because everyone's talked about it to death, and we all just kind of want to move past it at this point because there's not a lot we can do. Um, let's talk about the most interesting concept to me, and I won't even use interesting. The most I can't even think of the right word. It just it boggles my mind. It boondoggles my boondoggles, and that's the censorship and kind of the level of what the heck's going on with what people say. Um, like for instance, Trump getting banned from social media.
Yeah, to silence the leader of the free world on social media is quite extreme. They haven't slowed down either on cutting people off. And then, you get into this situation where they go, oh, well, if you don't like the way that we, do our rules here, then go start your own website and you can all congregate there. And then, they shut down Parlor. So that's
Right.
fascinating. And
So
nobody's being held to any kind of standards here because that wasn't like the government coming in and saying, oh, Parler's dangerous, they're spreading like terrorism or something like that, so you have to shut them down. No, that was a decision by the big tech, corporations themselves. I mean, Apple removed it from the App Store, it was removed from the Google Play Store, and then Amazon just took their servers down. So this wasn't like a government that decided. This wasn't the people that decided. This was big tech that decided what you get to see and what you don't get to see. And it astonishes me that nobody or that not enough people are outraged about this on both sides.
right, and something that and part of the reason why I think the left isn't as outraged as the right is because it supports them in a way. But kind of talking about how they weren't trying to make the point that Parler promotes terrorism. One
Well, that
thing
was
that
their excuse. Their excuse was that Parler was used in the coordination of like the insurrection and all that stuff, which is funny because then we found out later that Parler actually wasn't used in the coordination of the protest that took place at the Capitol. It was mostly Facebook and Twitter.
right, and the other thing that I think is hilarious talking about Facebook and Twitter and correlations between terrorist groups. Lots of people were recruited through ISIS through Facebook.
Oh yeah, terrorist organizations like known terrorist leaders, all allowed to keep their Twitters, all allowed to keep their Facebook, but the president of the United States has to be taken off.
Right, because obviously he's the real terrorist. He's the real threat to democracy right there.
Well, did you see that Twitter has gotten into a lot of trouble recently over a um, how to put it is the it was the pornographic images of a minor.
Oh yeah, yep. No, they were. You could type in any letter in the alphabet, press a button, and there was porn.
Well, this minor, one of these minors, is suing Twitter because they tried to get the tweet that had those images taken down, but Twitter said that it didn't violate their guidelines, and so
Which
they're refusing to take it down. And it's a tweet that has over 147,000 views now.
which blows my mind. Like we
So
jumped
child
down.
porn is okay on Twitter, but having dissenting views not okay.
Right, which is hilarious to me because everyone jumped down Netflix's throat for airing what was that show? Um,
Um, I think it
God,
was like Cuties.
yeah, because everyone was like, "Well, this is basically child porn."
Well, as they should, because I like to think that we can have some morals that we share as a country, and I would hope we would draw the line at you know that kind of stuff. Which, if you believe that the QAnon and all that stuff, and our top government officials are engaged in the like, so maybe that's a reason that no one's cracked down on this.
Right, and the degradation of standards is actually something I tried to. I was very unclear about when I did my last video, but that's kind of what a lot of other democracies before ours kind of started leading into was this degradation of what was and wasn't allowed.
Well, that's one of the ways that the communist parties were actually trained to bring down democracies.
Right, and I think one of the most interesting facts I learned while because I'm taking as I've said before, I'm trying to be a teacher. Um, One of the courses I'm taking is American Education Foundation, well, the foundations of American education. And you know what? The one thing in history class I was never taught was the fact that um, I wasn't taught anything. We talked tons about Hitler and fascism. We didn't talk about who started fascism because that would kind of sell the point a bit. But we talked a lot about um, Hitler, but we never talked about Russia and the rise of communism, like
Well, the big
at all.
thing is that, like, in the World War II context, right, Russia was sort of our allies at the time. And I think that had to do with why they weren't super bad-mouthed up until, sort of the Cold War stuff that happened. But then we've tried to move away from that as well, especially over the 2000s and the 2010s, because we had a president who was very friendly with the Russians and allowed them to take certain territories of the Ukraine basically unopposed.
Right, and and
Um,
and I'm almost inclined to think that the more extremists on the Democratic Party are looking towards the how socialism degrades democracy in order to establish their utopias as this the window of, as using this as their window of opportunity to do that.
yeah, I thankfully I had a history teacher that did talk a bit about sort of the Red Revolution and all that. Um, Not a whole lot. I had to do a lot more learning on my own, which is really unfortunate considering the death tolls or the difference in death tolls between communist regimes and fascist regimes.
Right, which is like when Lenin took power from Tsar Nicholas, what followed was a famine.
Well, yeah, because you had to kill all the successful farmers for being successful.
Right. And then what followed after that, which I think a lot of people tend to overlook because it doesn't fit the whole socialist utopia, is Lenin died. And there was a massive power grab
Yep.
orchestrated from the guy that Lenin said, "Hey, don't let this man be in charge." But he
Well,
was the one that
it's
put him
kind
in
of
charge
hard
of
to stop
jobs.
him. It's kind of hard to stop him if he's killing off everyone else that, could stop him.
Right. But people overlook that because they're like, "No, we can't talk about that because that makes everything look bad." Like say let's say, right, hypothetically, everything goes to shit, and Kamala Harris initiates like martial law, and a whole bunch of people end up dead, and then instead of this democracy, we switch to socialism. What happens when Kamala dies?
I mean, if Nancy Pelosi is still around, but Kamala is still quite young.
Right,
Um,
but you still run into the same issue, the same thing Stalin had when he died, the same thing Mao had when he died. The only person I can say for a fact that nailed it was Castro, and that's only because Castro's brother took over.
yeah, I don't know if we'll be going into that sort of situation. I in because we already have a system set up where we basically elect a new person every 4 years. And since what happened that wasn't supposed to happen, that the founders didn't anticipate happening, is that all of the legislatures would, they would come together as a party and put their party before their own personal interests. And so what's been happening is that we keep giving more and more power to the executive. Um, and I mean, just look at Biden and his 30-ish, I think it's 30 plus now, executive orders in his like first 2 weeks.
Right, which is insane.
And he's got complete support for it because they know that if they try to take this kind of stuff through the legislature where it should be, it'll get filibustered and shot down because there's still some form of um, stop in the legislature. And executive orders were never meant to be used like this. I mean, executive orders aren't even in the Constitution. It was just a way for the executive to execute the will of the legislature because it's all the steps in between, right?
Right. And one of the things I found historically interesting, before Obama, do you know who the last person to use the most executive orders were?
Who's that?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II, because he required the executive order to push legislation in order to support troops.
Well, I mean, that all comes down to like emergency powers and stuff like that. So, I mean,
Right,
if you just declare something an emergency, then you can use whatever executive powers you want in order to make your legislation happen because it's an emergency. And it's that's like Star Wars 101. That's exactly how the chancellor, took ultimate power in the empire was by giving himself emergency powers and the legislature, in there, the Galactic Senate voted on it. That was the whole famous sign or the whole famous meme about liberty dying to thunderous applause.
right.
Which
Um,
is funny because everybody was like, why are we doing politics in the prequels, and people got mad at George Lucas for it. But it's kind of interesting to see parallels in our media that sort of were far ahead of the things that are happening now. And I mean, it's crazy because the left is enamored with the media and with movies in Hollywood, and that's always been a progressive um, like structure.
well, Hollywood wasn't always left. Reagan, when Reagan was in Hollywood, it was definitely more of a conservative. It's kind of a conservative mindset, but that transitioned later. One of the reasons I think that George Lucas followed the politics in the prequels is, interestingly, not only does it mirror our current situation, but it also mirrored the rise of Hitler through his means of securing power, because he fought with other, because obviously the National Socialist Party, which let's just
No,
take a
we're not
second
allowed
to
to
think
call
about
that
that name.
anymore.
No, right,
They're only Nazis.
because they can't be socialist, they can't be left, they have to be right, even though fascism was born from leftist ideas. But we're not allowed to say that. Um, but it kind of mirrors when Hitler was like, yeah, so I'm gonna be chancellor now, and everyone was like, yeah, I guess so. He's like, cool. Well, we're currently going to die of starvation and economic collapse. So why don't you guys just give me all the power, and I can fix it? And that's what happened.
I mean, to be fair, he did fix a lot of it.
Right, he was terrible, but he did pull Germany for a short while out of economic ruin,
Yep.
just for them to go right back into it.
Yep.
But but
But I
but
mean, the
let's
empire was always supposed to represent a fascist government. I mean, that's the whole point of the matching like stormtrooper uniforms and all that.
right. And I think that's part of the reason why, when George Lucas focused on politics in the prequels, he was drawing from the rise of fascism, which which we're kind of seeing today. And what's interesting is it also mirrors Roman history, because after Caesar died, we had another big civil war, and then we just kind of went away with the. I mean, the Senate still existed, but they weren't really as predominant, nor did they matter as much.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why again the country wasn't supposed to be a democracy. We were supposed to be
A republic.
a republic.
Right. We're I think the proper term is a democratic republic.
And this was to put in these checks and balances to stop this kind of thing from happening. But they're sort of, and they say it's really funny because they say those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But I don't think you're supposed to use the rise of fascism as a playbook.
Mein Kampf is not a how-to guide.
Yeah. Well, and it kills me because if you talk to like your everyday supporter of the left, they can't see it. They can't see the parallels.
No, they
Um,
absolutely and sometimes they absolutely refuse to. I don't go out and seek arguments, but there are certain people that when you talk to them about it, that's what they devolve into, because they don't want to accept what you're saying, and it boggles my mind.
well, a good friend of mine who I had as a roommate for a while. I do talk to him every once in a while on Facebook because he posts some stuff that is like without any context or a factual, and it's like, or just no evidence of. That's like, well, have you rationalized this as an opinion? Have you like thought this through? And so I get into these conversations with him, and one of the ones that struck me recently was he told me this line. He's like, "Yeah, I have friends on the right, and I'll be friends with people on the right, but I'll never believe a word they say because it's all lies." And I'm
Right,
like,
which
"Whoa!" Like you're not even gonna listen, you know?
right, and that goes into kind of what George Orwell was talking about in 1984. You can't listen to what other people say, because what if they're right? Does that make you wrong?
Well,
Are
then
are
you
you
get
now
into
the
cognitive
opposition?
dissonance, which is a powerful force.
Right, but that's what we're seeing. It's there's so many parallels and so many warning signs that people just kind of go, no, that's never going to happen. That we just miss.
Yep. Well, and it's A recent one that was pointed out by Ben Shapiro that I thought was really funny is that there was this whole controversy over, I want to say he was a senator, and he was a ranger. And so he went through ranger training in the army, which, means that he gets to call himself a ranger because he, took the training pass and he has the badge.
Right.
Um, but he never actually served in a ranger company. So now they're claiming that he has stolen honor. I think that's what they
Stolen
call it.
stolen valor.
Stolen valor. Yeah, stolen valor, because he's calling himself a ranger, but he never served in a ranger company.
Just
Um,
yeah. It's like
and
saying sorry.
well, I was
That's
going to say, and the news source that was getting on him about this had previously written an article about two women that made it through the ranger training and was had called them rangers. And so, because they couldn't be wrong, what they did was, instead of changing the story and not saying that he had stolen valor, because then they wouldn't be able to smear him. What they did is they went back to their previous article and changed that article so that it no longer said that the women were rangers, but only that they passed the ranger training.
of course, because redacting the truth just makes everything better.
And
It
that's
fixes
just
all the
like
problems.
straight 1984. I mean, the main character of 1984, his job was literally to rewrite history.
Right, and that's one of, if you've ever read Ben Shapiro's book How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps, that's one of the steps. Which is why I think the kind of getting into the next subject, that the fucking, I hate this book so much. I hated the article. And the person is just stupid dumb. But the 1619 Project. Let's just let's just blame all of American racism by tying in British slavery to the colonies. Let's tie in the fact that slaves helped develop the colonies, helped develop the fact that the South became an economic powerhouse because of free labor to meet the demands of their cash crops. Let's tie that all into the fact that was America. It happened on American soil, but we weren't America then.
No, and a lot of the founding fathers wanted to abolish slavery. I mean, everybody talks about how Thomas Jefferson and George Washington owned slaves, but like Jefferson literally had letters that he'd written that we have as historical documents, where he lamented the fact that he owned slaves, and the same thing with Washington. In Washington's case, the problem was that his family owed money to the bank, so he couldn't just let the slaves go because they were considered property. And anybody that owns a house, that owes a mortgage to the bank, understands the fact that that's not really your house, that's the bank's house.
Right, until it's paid off, you don't own anything.
Exactly. And so he couldn't let the slaves go because they were considered property, and they weren't even really his property, they were the bank's property. And
Right,
so we're talking about, house servants at the time who lived much better than like field hands down in the South.
and the other thing is, when people talk about Washington or Jefferson, they always bring up I can't remember her name right now.
The
He
fact that he had a daughter.
no, the black slave that they say he essentially just kept uh he'd sleep with her, she'd have a kid, and he'd let the kid go free. um God, I can't think of uh give me just a sec.
I know what you're talking about. I don't remember her name, but I know that he was famous for having relations with his slaves, or I should say infamous.
And they always, and Sally Hemings.
Yeah, her doesn't her hasn't her family made it like a really big deal recently?
Yeah, because um because it was a long-term sexual relationship, and while she was never free, her children were, and that was the big deal. Is it was essentially he essentially took advantage of her.
Hmm. Well, I mean, from all the historical writings that we have, we know that none of them were perfect people. But at least as far as he goes, we know that he did not want to keep slaves and that he wanted to abolish the practice in the country, but he just didn't have the support to do it.
Right, and then the other big the really big one in my opinion that most people tend to overlook because it doesn't fit the whole slavery thing fully is the Trail of Tears when he bought the Louisiana Purchase.
What about it?
Uh, Hundreds, thousands are, I don't know the exact number, but quite a few Native Americans died.
Oh, I mean the founding fathers and, even after that. If anybody in this country really should have beef with the US government, it should be Native Americans. Although
Which,
the problem there is that you have to understand that that was a war, right? People like to call it like a genocide and whatnot, but there were battles fought, and even though they were horribly lopsided, it was still, a battle between two nations, and it was conquered territory. And then, with the Louisiana Purchase, they at least gave them the opportunity to leave.
right, and let's and they, I have my grandfather's Native, and one of the big things I asked him when I got older was because when I turned 16, I graduated and I started kind of getting more politically conscious. And I asked him how he felt, and he said it doesn't matter, you know, to him anymore because look what he can do now. And I think a lot of people tend to. He says he what he told me was it seems like a lot of people tend to get hung up on these past issues not because they're actually outraged by what happened, but because he knows that certain people are just banking on the reparations.
Oh, and I mean, there's so many people that you can consider like race baiters. There's a lot of the quote unquote leaders in certain communities just take advantage of the fact that they can point and say, well, there's the cause of all your problems. Um, go yell at them until they fix it. And all these people do is take advantage of these past situations to look for future gains.
Right, and that's
And it doesn't help anybody really move forward. And that was one of the really big things, as far as like slavery reparations and that stuff goes too, is that you have to look forward.
right, and one of the big things that I think a lot of people tend to tend to not want to think about is the people that are trying to hold us back from moving past racist thinking, moving past paying reparations are the same people saying, well, by being colorblind, you're not really anti-racist. You're being more racist now by not acknowledging the fact that different colors exist.
Oh, are you talking about a non-race based meritocracy?
Yeah,
The thing that Martin Luther King Jr. was pushing for?
yeah,
Yeah, well, we can't have that because, then you're not privileging the people that should be privileged.
right. And that goes, and I think the most hilarious part about that, because it literally just dawned on me, is that goes directly against this and I think a lot of people that support it don't tend to tend to think of the the phrase as being worthwhile because of our founding fathers and some of the things they hold against them, that all men were created equal. They can't have that be true, because if that were true, then what they're doing is worse than just progressing.
I mean, it definitely is. Though, if you want to look at real racism in the United States right now, you look at the left. And it was really funny. I saw a video on this today where a reporter was going through college campuses, and he was asking, random college students, whether or not they supported voter ID laws, right? So it's really basic question, and all these white college students went, "No, I don't support voter ID," and he's like, "Well, why?" And almost every single one of them answered something like, "Well, these people don't know how to get ID, or that dis was it disprivileges minorities and black people because they don't know how to carry ID and stuff like that." And it's crazy because you have to look at the way that they're phrasing those statements. It's they don't know how, they're not able to, and it's funny because then he went to like a Bronx neighborhood and asked random black people on the street. He's like, "Do you carry ID?" And they're like, "Yeah." Every single one. He's like, "Do you know where the DMV is?" And a couple of guys were like, "Yeah, it's on 125th Street." And it's like it's this crazy mentality where they feel like they have this savior complex, and it's been coined the soft bigotry of low expectations, and that is fundamentally racist. You believe that people are incapable based off of the color of their skin.
Right, and I'm almost certain I saw that video, and that's exactly it's exactly right. And I think that's a large part of why the country's so divided right now. They those the pushing of that agenda has essentially made it so the left goes, "We'll take care of you. We know what's best for you." And when you hear
Yeah,
them
just
talk,
give us your vote.
yeah, and when you hear them talk, it's very condescending. Like, I'm here. I know what's best for you. As a privileged white person, I promise I can take care of you. And you're like, what? No.
Well, so you have to look back at welfare when you're looking at this kind of stuff, and that's how welfare was pushed to black communities, was as a form of reparations, which is really funny because black communities were on the rise before welfare, and if you look at the data, it's like really apparent that welfare basically just killed all progress in the black communities.
Right, but you can't say that.
What do you mean I can't say that?
No, you can't say that because if that were true, then the welfare state is a lie.
Well, the welfare state is a lie.
No, I know, but that's when you have a conversation with someone about that, that's exactly what I've gotten every time.
Well, that you can't criticize the welfare state.
Right, because it helps so many people. It's not something that people use as a crutch and never get off of. It's just something to help people bounce back. Why would we take away their safety net? And I'm like, because it's not a safety net. It's a cocoon that you tell people is a safety net, and then when they climb in, most people don't want to get out.
Well, and the thing is, right, is that in every way, shape, and form, the welfare system is designed to keep poor people poor. Like, it has such a huge negative impact on culture. It has a huge negative impact on marriage rates. It has a huge negative impact on education and the value of education in the homes. And this doesn't even have to do with race. So Thomas Sowell is, big economist, really famous, and he goes through looking at how the welfare state impacts communities. And so, we saw the same exact thing happen in Great Britain, where they introduced the welfare state, and then a certain class of people developed that didn't value education, were very violent, didn't value marriage because, again, you're de incentivizing marriage. You literally are like, well, if you get married, we're not going to give you money, right?
Right, and now that you and as you kind of lay that out, that you look at the statistics for the black community, and it's deadpan light right there.
Well, and so one of the really interesting things is that it all comes down to, again, those dissolution of social values. And so marriage was a big social value because it's something that works, right? The family is supposed to be the foundation of society.
Right, and
But
that
when you de-incentivize marriage, you're, dissolving that fundamental structure, and it has very obvious effects. I mean, if you look statistically right now at married couples in the United States, I'm going to say, I have to remember these off the top of my head. So it was like 11% of black couples that were married were under the poverty line, even though it's like 22% of black people are under the poverty line. But like married black people are better off than unmarried white people,
Really?
even. Yeah.
Um, then one of the big people who advocate for the black community in a positive light, in my opinion, is Candace Owens, and I'm kind of thinking about what you were saying, and that kind of ties into the video I watched with her debating with this group of people. Um, and she was saying how by removing black fathers, by focusing on just trying to make ends meet instead of fixing the community and fixing these problems, that's and kind of getting themselves out of this mindset of welfare, or the system's never going to keep us, the system's only there to keep us down, which, I mean, you're right, it kind of is, because it wants to keep them in that place. um it was interesting to see the I think I forget who she was debating against, um but he was adamant about how wrong she was. I'm trying to remember who it was. um but it was she was advocating for more for fathers to stay in homes, the reduction of crime, getting out of the welfare system in order to kind of make a better life for themselves. Um,
You talking about Candace Owens?
yeah,
Yeah. Well, and all these things really fit in together too. And it's crazy how it all comes together to make this absolute, terrible situation that we have nowadays. Because it's not just like the welfare state. I mean, the minimum wage has a huge effect on this as well. And so now you're looking at, due to the welfare state, you're looking at a lot of fatherless males, right? And now, due to minimum wage laws, you're looking at a lot of fatherless males with no jobs on the street, which is the absolute worst place for a young male to be hanging out.
right.
And so all of this just led to the significant rise in gangs that we saw over the early 2000s
Even in the 90s, I mean, you
and the
look at,
90s. Yeah.
yeah, the big ones were the Crips and Bloods during the 90s. And even kind of like what eventually rap music began to talk about more when NWA kind of got involved and started talking about some of the things they were dealing with, because people were getting violent, and people were you know stuck on the street without a job. Kind of a side note, the minimum wage people keep screaming to raise the minimum wage because you can't live off of it. I think people have a strange misconception about what minimum wage was meant to be. It's not the minimum amount that you're supposed to be able to live off of, and I think people don't want to accept that.
Well, I mean, that was the original concept, but by the time that the minimum wage laws got implemented, because things in government take time, and this is a really funny story actually, because this was happening amidst the Great Depression. So by the time the law actually got um, implemented, inflation had skyrocketed so much that the numbers that were proposed in the original law were absolutely worthless. So when the law was originally passed, the amount was supposed to be enough for you to live off of, but inflation made that value quickly irrelevant, as it's done today. So yeah, 725 is not enough to live off of, and it's not supposed to be like you
Right.
said, but it was supposed to be, which is why they're arguing that we should raise it. But it
But
has
it,
had
then
such a negative effect that you're curing the disease with more of the disease.
right, you're just injecting more of the problem. The solution I think most people need to think about is, if you want us to go kind of back into the better living situation that we were in, the number one thing we need to cut is government spending. I mean, our tax dollars, that, like, it's tax season. I'm sure everyone's excited to get their tax refund and all that. But all those taxes we paid, they were already gone. Like, that's all been spent. So we've spent more than we've given, and now we're probably borrowing in order to continue spending. And if we want to solve some of the economic problems we're having, if we cut government spending, eventually we can break down this deficit, or the debt that we're in. And as the debt lowers, we'll be able to kind of, our dollar will be worth more because it won't be weighed against anything like our debt. Um, and inflation we won't see as much of a rise in inflation because we won't need to constantly be printing money. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
Oh, by the way, I have the numbers on the marriage rates versus poverty rates versus
Oh
race.
yeah, go ahead, hit us with that.
So this is from the late 2000s, and the numbers have actually they were getting better, but now they're starting to get worse.
What
Um,
time frame were they getting better?
in the mid 2010s, so around
Okay.
2015, 2016, they were starting to get better up until 2018, and then they've started to decline.
So so 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018 were essentially the golden period in
Well,
this
not
history.
really. I mean, and it when I say get better or worse, I mean we're talking about like less than a percentage point,
Oh,
really.
okay. So there was real no difference.
No, these rates have actually stayed pretty steady. The only thing that's been getting worse is the marriage rate, actually. That's what's been significantly worse.
Really?
Because the difference here is going to be the marriage rate. So for um, black people that are married, they only have a 9.9% poverty rate. So what that means is 9.9% of the black people that are married in the United States fall under the poverty line, right?
Right.
39.5% of those people or sorry, 39.5% of black people in the United States that aren't married fall under the poverty line. So, I mean, just on that alone, marriage seems to make about a 30 percentage point difference, which is tremendous. And if you look at the rate of child poverty, you see something even worse. So 13.7% of the black children under 5-year-old or under 5 years old are poor, right? So fall under that poverty line.
Right.
And those are the 13.7% of black children under 5 to married parents. 58.1% of black children under 5 years old with non-married parents fall under the poverty line.
Jesus. And
And then for white people, um, the poverty line for people that are married is about 6%. So 6% of white people that are married fall under that poverty line, and
right.
only 9.9% of the 5-year-olds, of the white 5-year-olds to married households fall under that poverty line. But 26.4% of non-married white people fall under that poverty line. So again, you see that huge increase in 52% of the 5-year-olds um, to unmarried white people fall under the poverty line. So, I mean, they actually have comparable stats, but the really big thing here is that um, the poverty rate for white married people is better, but the poverty rate for married black people is still significantly better than the poverty rate for unmarried white people.
Right, and I think that's something most people. I'm glad that you shared that because now more when people listen, they'll get to know that, which explains a lot about why people like Candace Owens who actively are trying to change how Black communities think about things, push for marriage so much. Makes a lot more sense now.
Yep.
Um,
And I mean, marriage has just been absolutely under attack in
right,
the United States.
because it supports individualism instead of
Yeah, because you put your family before your country.
right, and that's not a socialist ideal.
Nope. You got to put the country before everything. Otherwise, socialism doesn't work, right?
Right. um,
Which is ironic that all of the, liberal elites are all happily married. If you've
and
ever noticed that, go take a look at the liberal elite marriage rates.
I
It's
definitely
fascinating.
I definitely will. All right, we're gonna have to wrap it up now. Um, I thank you, Andrew, for coming on the show. You're insightful as always. Um,
Thanks for having me. I'm sorry for bringing, some sad statistics to bear, but I hope there's a little bit of a glimmer of light there, and you know, get married. Turns
and
out people that are getting married are probably more responsible and tend to not be poor.
and I think that also has a lot to do with when you start having kids, you tend to stop spending recklessly. I mean, that's something I learned after I had
Well,
my
some
first
people
child.
do.
Oh yeah, obviously not everyone does, but it definitely once you add a wife and a child or a husband and a child to the mix, you tend to stop thinking selfishly.
Unfortunately, there are in fact people out there that do have children just to receive money from the government.
No, and I'm fully aware of that. I'm just saying as a general statement. From what I've seen, most people tend to be more financially responsible.
Well, yeah, because if you're married, you don't get money from the government.
Right. Obviously, we can't talk about that though, because that's wrong. Just like bringing up statistics is wrong.
Well, anybody that wants to shut me down that listens to this, just remember I'm Puerto Rican. And before you say anything, no, I have not internalized my white supremacy.
Oh my!
So thank you very much.
I unfortunately am white. I don't have a card to play.
I mean, you've got a half black sister, right?
I
Like,
do, and a Native American grandfather.
yeah, you already played that one earlier. See, we're good. We're good. The hand has been dealt, and it has been played.
Right. So, as always, that was our guest Andrew, and I was your host Robbie, and we wish you the best. Bye.
Bye.